Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, president and founder of the Current Consulting Group, and I'm joined again today by Brian Feeley, vice president of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Bill.
So this is yet another installment in our ongoing series on oral fluid testing. And today we're going to talk about a little bit more sort of a more complex issue for some people that maybe are new to oral fluid testing. And that's the difference between detecting parent THC and a metabolite of THC and why that's important. And of course, you're hearing a lot about this today or nowadays because of these new laws in California and Washington that refer to not testing for the non-psychoactive metabolite of marijuana. So understanding this issue is very, very important. Brian Feeley, of course, as many of you know, spent over 25 years at OraSure Technologies, and he's an expert on oral fluid testing. And so we're going to talk about those issues today. Brian, what's the difference between parent THC and a metabolite of THC, and why is that important?
Sure, Bill. So this is quickly becoming one of my most favorite topics in the drug testing world. And so just to take a step back away from THC for a moment and just talking about parent drugs versus metabolites. So a parent drug is typically what you're going to see in someone's system immediately upon doing a drug, whether that's cocaine or marijuana or another form. What typically happens is it gets into your bloodstream right away and also gets into oral fluid right away. So that drug is really typically present in its parent form. It hasn't broken down. What I mean by that is when your body processes a drug, it goes through your system and ends up going through your organs and ends up, of course, in your urine. And the body breaks that down from the parent drug into metabolites. So think about it a little bit as a breakdown process of really anything you might absorb or take into your body. Your body's designed to break things down and to process them and eventually excrete them. And so what you end up with in oral fluid is a lot of the parent drug. Not that you don't have any metabolite in there for certain drug classes, but typically it's the parent drug. And then as you test the urine sample, you're typically dealing with the metabolite of that drug. So it's not necessarily the active form. So now going back to marijuana. So with THC, the parent form of the drug is the delta 9 THC. And that is essentially the psychoactive form of the drug. That's what gives you the high. What ends up, and there's very little to no metabolite of THC in that oral fluid sample. Studies have been done years ago to try to determine whether or not the metabolite test would be the right one for oral fluid and whether that should be included in the federal guidelines, and they ruled that out. There was almost none to be found, and if it was found, it was at such low levels you could never detect it with the tests that are being used on the market. So you're primarily dealing with the parent THC in oral fluid, and in the urine, you're dealing with the metabolite. And I have a slide that we'll show here in a minute. But so that's the difference, Bill. And the non-psychoactive form of the drug is the form that it's not giving you the high. And so, the basis for these tests, we're really trying to rule out the metabolite because that represents past use. That's something you did days or potentially weeks ago. Whereas the parent is something that's in your system now. It's in your oral fluid now from a very recent use.
So what forms of marijuana are we typically testing for in oral fluid, urine, and hair? And are they all accurate?
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, accuracy is a question of the analytical method that you're using and how well it's working. What you're finding in the different sample types is really a question of what is in there and what that sample type really represents, as we were just talking about. On this screen, you'll see kind of the further breakdown of what I was talking about with regard to the sample type. So with urine and hair, you really are looking at a sample type that is detecting the non-psychoactive form of the drug because they're the metabolites of THC. That's that THC COOH you see on the screen. That's the carboxylic acid form of THC. It's the form that the body has processed and it's ended up in the urine. and that's what you test for in a urine screen. With oral fluid and breath, you're really looking at the psychoactive form. It's something that has come from the bloodstream into that sample type. In the case of breath, it's more from the lung and the interaction with the bloodstream. Where you're dealing with psychoactive form of the drug, that's the parent or the delta 9 THC. And so, very simple chart that I think people need to understand this, that when you're dealing with urine and hair, you're dealing with the metabolite. When you're dealing with oral fluid and breath, you're dealing with the parent or the psychoactive form of the drug.
So, what's the window of impairment with oral fluid testing and marijuana? And does that have any correlation to impairment?
Well, good question. That happened to be the next slide on my screen. So really, some of the studies that have been done over many years were accumulated in something from the University of Sydney. I'm sure we have the reference for this, but there were something like 80 studies that were looked at as part of that. And from all those studies, they determined that the impairment window is somewhere between, right after use up to 10 hours. And so that means that during that time frame, when they looked at people and they looked at their ability to perform certain tasks and or inability to perform certain tasks, that they saw a time period up to as much as 10 hours. And in fact, some of the studies that were in there are kind of interesting. They show impairment going even beyond 10 hours, depending upon the strength of the drug and the situation and administration of it. But typically, you're looking at that 3 to 10 hour window. And this slide really shows that breath is really only covering that immediate use up to maybe 2 or 3 hours. Urine, sometimes, especially if it's a new use, a casual use, you won't find anything in the urine sample until maybe 4 to 6 hours later, when the metabolite actually does show up. And so really, when you're looking at an impairment window, oral fluid really represents the best choice, because you get it right after use, and it lasts at least up to 8 or 10 hours. With a rapid test, you're typically finding it well within that 10-hour window. Lab-based testing can sometimes go a little longer. It depends on the concentration. The reports have shown that you can get a positive in oral fluid for marijuana out to about 24 hours. But the rapid tests are definitely more in that 10-hour window.
So right now, a big issue, and it will be throughout 2024, are these new laws in California and Washington, and perhaps we'll see legislation in other states that are similar to those two states, that prevent employers from taking any adverse action against either a job applicant in the case of both states, or employees as well in the state of California, if a positive test for marijuana was based on a drug testing method that only revealed the presence of a metabolite, or the non-psychoactive metabolite of marijuana, versus the parent drug. So in states like that, states that have restricted drug testing in one way or another, like California, Washington, is oral fluid testing a viable alternative? Can employers consider oral fluid testing as a way to continue testing their employees or applicants for marijuana and not give up the benefits of drug testing?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, when you think about it from and I'm speaking about it from the technical standpoint and from the practical standpoint of what those tests do and what they detect. An oral fluid sample, as we've talked about, really contains parent THC. The tests that are designed for marijuana in oral fluid are geared toward or directed toward the parent THC. So, everything you're doing, and up to and including the confirmation of a sample, a positive screen goes to a lab for confirmation testing. They're confirming for the presence of the parent drug. So all those things align very nicely with the ability to use oral fluid in those settings. Now, the laws themselves don't specify what you can and can't do in terms of specimen type, right? They just talk about psychoactive, non-psychoactive form of the drug. But we all know that the intention of those laws are really to allow, with the legalization of marijuana, to allow people that the employees the right to use their substances in their off time, and not be discriminated against when they come into the workplace, which is fine and dandy for those states. And but again, just like with alcohol, Bill, you wouldn't want someone coming into the workplace drunk, having consumed a bottle of bourbon before their shift, right? You also don't want them to have smoked a THC joint that's 30% potency, or 50 or more. Some of the things that are out there, highly potent forms of THC. So you don't want them working in the workplace either. And those laws certainly didn't appear to try to restrict you from testing for marijuana. Otherwise, they would have said that. They would have just ruled out marijuana testing completely, right? They left it open. They left the door open to say, okay, it's got to be psychoactive form. That correlates with oral fluid and breath. Therefore, one can draw that conclusion that you're pretty safe using it.
Now, you've talked about some technical and practical angles to it, but if a company wants to switch from one drug testing method to oral fluid, they would have to update their drug testing policy, I would imagine, to stay in compliance with the various state laws that apply. And as I asked that question, I realized that I know the answer, but go ahead and answer it, Brian.
Well, sure, yeah. So your policy should be updated on a pretty regular basis, regardless of this whole marijuana situation. We sometimes find that people have drug testing policies and they haven't dusted them off for 5 years or even 10 years, and so that's just you just want. So many things have changed, even above and beyond marijuana, that you want to keep up on your policy and look at that at least on an annual basis. And certainly right now, if you're in any of those states that have implemented those laws, you definitely want to update the policy to make sure that it includes the ability to do oral fluid, that your supervisors are trained, they understand what they need to do and how they need to work with their employees, how they need to train and make sure their employees are aware of that change in the policy. So all those things have to be done and buttoned up.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a little plug in here for Current Compliance. That's our online database of state laws that affect drug testing, currentcompliance.org. And one of the things that we do is we literally track all legislation that could affect drug testing. And of course, nowadays, a lot of it has to do with marijuana. And we do that every week, and we update the database every week as necessary to make sure that people who subscribe to our database have up-to-date information. And oral fluid testing in particular, and especially affected by the marijuana issue, are really hot topics at the state level. I think last year there were over 500 bills introduced that, if passed, could have had an indirect or direct impact on workplace drug testing programs. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. For example, maybe you can address this, Brian. You've mentioned that there's a difference between rapid result or point of collection oral fluid testing and lab-based oral fluid testing. But there would also be a difference in how state laws treat those two different testing methods, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And just like with urine screening, where an instant test may be used, the same thing applies for oral fluid testing. So there are with few exception, you can use oral fluid in all states. But generally, there are restrictions that relate to the use of a point of collection, let's call it test, or instant rapid test. Some states allow for it without restrictions. Some require that it's FDA cleared. Some require that the test is even run in a licensed facility, like in the case of the state of New York. And I believe Minnesota has some stipulations in some other states. So you want to be aware of that. There are very few states that have no guidance and no laws and no restrictions, and it's pretty much carte blanche of what you want to do. There's only a few of those that I know of. Most of them have some sort of requirements related to the drug test method that you're using, where you're doing the collection or who's doing the collection, whether the method is approved or not. And again, that lab licensure piece comes into play in some states.
Yeah, and an important issue to bring up, and we have a podcast where I interview Yvette Baker, who's our on-staff attorney here at Current Consulting Group. But some states have a mandatory drug testing law, and there's a group of about 15 or so states that have voluntary drug testing laws. And I know voluntary law sounds like an oxymoron, but essentially what it means is if you want to participate in this program and qualify for certain benefits, that the state's offering, like here in Florida, a 5% discount on your workers' compensation premiums, you have to follow these procedures for drug testing. And some of them may refer specifically to lab-based urine testing. It wasn't that they meant to prohibit oral fluid testing. It's just that when they wrote the bill or the law 25 years ago, there were not a lot of companies doing oral fluid testing back then. Now, of course, it's become much, much more common. But outside of those voluntary laws, like here in Florida, there isn't a mandatory law that then comes into play. So in Florida, those restrictions, whatever they may be, or Georgia or Tennessee, et cetera, would only apply to companies participating in the program. And if there was some restriction on the method of testing, it wouldn't apply outside of the voluntary program for companies that are not participating in the program. And to Brian's point, you're going to want to update your drug testing policy either way to make sure that it reflects how you're doing drug testing. That's an important thing for your employees to know, so that if you're in a state that's legalized marijuana, they know you're using a drug testing method that detects parent THC, for example, and that's sort of employee and employer friendly when it comes to detecting the drug in somebody's system, either as an applicant or an employee. But a lot to go over there. That's why we have an entire series of episodes of Currently Speaking on oral fluid testing. And with that, Brian, let me give you the last word. Anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, just kind of in line with what you were talking about, Bill, on the state laws and your policy. We get this question a lot where people want to know, hey, I'm based in the state of Pennsylvania. That's our headquarters. Are we okay? We have employees in 10 other states, but we're based in Pennsylvania. Is that all we need to do in terms of covering in our policy? And the answer to that is really no. You need to look at each state and make sure that you're following the laws where those employees fall. We do that as part of the policy writing phase, where we'll include, of course, the home base, but also there'll be addendums for each of the states that you do business with, if there is something that needs to be included relative to those states. So just be aware of that. And then the other thing I would add, Bill, is, people sometimes ask, well, given all of the benefits of oral fluid, and now with all of the things related in California and Washington with Metabolite and parent THC, what does somebody do if they want to add oral fluid to their program? And I think, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. You can talk to your provider. You can talk to people in the industry, and you can talk to Current Consulting Group. Of course, we can help with that as well. But basically, you want to consider the products that are on the market. Make sure you're doing your due diligence. Make sure that if it's non-DOT, of course, we're really only talking about non-DOT and non-mandated testing right now, but that you do update that policy to include oral fluid, and you do the right training. I always recommend piloting something. It's a great way to get introduced to it, to make sure that you're comfortable with the product, how it works, how it functions, what kind of results you're seeing, what the reaction is with your workforce. And so as it relates to DOT or regulated testing, right now we have to hold off on that. It is part of both the federal and the DOT guidelines now. Oral fluid is allowed. However, we are still waiting for 2 laboratories to be inspected and certified by HHS in order for that testing with regulated individuals and employees to begin.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Excellent presentation. Again, if you have any questions about oral fluid testing, about updating your policy, about state drug testing laws, especially as they pertain to oral fluid testing, please reach out to us. You can contact Brian directly. His information is on the screen, or you can visit our website at currentconsultinggroup.com, and we will be happy to address any questions that you might have. And with that ends another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. Thanks for joining us. Check out our website for other editions of Currently Speaking.